Yes, and welcome. And really, before we get started, just going to have to wrap a couple things up from last time. The the conversation around what you're signing up for, what you can expect to get out of your care, no matter really where you get it. Um, I do believe that there are multiple pathways to healing and recovery, and know that to be true. I think it takes many different forms, and there are stages and or levels of healing. People can think about it from a physical standpoint. A physical wound, the healing begins automatically. There is a effort to help and do what is needed. There is a solution. The solution that you work is the healing. The truth that you live is the truth that you are. And the difference between our following our socially prescribed right thing to do versus the right thing to do for the moment or for the person for the bigger picture. And so any conflict that you have is coming from two different places. And, confronting you, America, on your diet is not an easy thing to do. But I bring this awareness because it's kind of what we don't talk about. The solutions are many in that instance. When you have enough money and resources to buy the right thing for you, people typically do. When they have, I would say, a key ingredient as to a reason to want to be here now. There has to be something in this physical world that makes it worth it. There has to be a goal, a vision, a outcome that is desired. Otherwise, true change doesn't happen. And we stay in the purgatory that we label our purgatory. And maybe we enjoy it sometimes, and other times we don't. But realistically, we have to care. We have to find a reason to be here. And if that reason is to support the next generation or to continue on the path of supporting what we have come to see as the way, that we are going to do this as a species by building and creating technology to serve us because we don't want to do it ourselves. When we get into psychological work, there's really nobody who can do it for you. The difference between, to me, a therapist and a healer is a healer will do it with you. And that's the difference. What a healer is acknowledging is that in order to stay in the present, we have to have some opposition, some force that makes us justified for being who and what we are. Some polar opposite. And so, as if that side is bad, who is labeling it as such? So, the reason why I have to revisit this is because a lot of therapy and healing is re-educating on what we know to be true and what we don't. What we know to be what we want and what we need. In the wisdom of lived experience versus quantitative analysis and some sort of robotic science that thinks it has an answer and can fix problems by finding a gene or giving a pill. Like, that is just justifying their experience or their existence. I believe a healer walks in the light of truth. And truth being subjective as to who, what, when, why, and how. I think it's important, before you really sign on the dotted line, that we go through a thorough assessment and evaluation. And don't really start the healing services until you have a very clear understanding of what it is you are asking for by coming to a healer versus a therapist. Because America, as you become aware of the example of the diet, it's going to be tied to corporate interests. For example, if you watch Netflix, you can watch like Forks Over Knives, and you can see how the industry of professions work. You can watch Netflix and watch a lot of those type of specials and see how industry works. And it's so much subjective. I don't know how subjective that is at this point. Anybody who has worked a job has found the underbelly of the exploitation and how they are gaining profits. Now, the real issue when it comes to like addiction is the exponential profits, let alone the socialist idea of Karl Marx being able to say that people who aren't producing anything or making money on money is a dangerous exponential factor that, extrapolating it, multiplying it, compounding without real effort, then you're taking energy from somewhere. An exponential taking of energy from things is a destructive force. It is something that is tearing down something. It is taking and is sucking the life out of something so it can live. And what that illness is any illness. The concept of illness. Feeding and consuming, all consuming, not being able to stop consuming is a definition of addiction. And it's a good one. And there are life-damaging consequences. And then you have professions who make money on that. You have industries that are supporting corporatized, standardized, ethical levels of standards that are equated to law. And when the law is subjective in the international, really poker game, and then you have resulting war and death and poison, and you have generations paying the cost for not addressing the intergenerational trauma between the generations, between the parent, child, between the past and the present and the future. The inability to understand the generational gap that exists in development is to miss the years and gaps of the individual life, things that we don't want to remember, truths that we may not want to accept about what our story is. As an example, I am 45 years old. I was 7 years old in 1986. 1986, there was an event that anybody around that age would remember. The generations that may not remember it weren't probably connected to it old enough, or old enough that it is just another example of American exceptionalism and a media bonanza, a sell, a SELL, a sales pitch. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't. But it was the Challenger. And maybe you remember that it happened. Maybe you remember details. Your ability to put yourself back into that experience, if you can remember it. And if you can't remember it, the reasons why, you were too young or can kind of just get the gist of it. Memory works on the gist of things. And since, again, memory becomes a part of us physically as we share our story, the danger is applying what we get from critically thinking about our story. The meaning derived from it. The moral of the story. And to me, the moral of this story, of getting proper assessment and evaluation, is to recognize the system that it comes from as what is the standard and as what is the moral of the story. And as the moral of the story goes, we have to have a clear understanding of the ethics and the ethics of the words we choose, and the moral of the meaning that we give the words that we choose. I argue that we need moral ethics because it suggests morally above ethics, because ethics have been equated to law, and this is bureaucratic tyranny. It is the responsibility of the social to the social constructs, the professions that are to preserve a sanity that has been influenced by corporate greed and American exceptionalism and this intergenerational disease of more, stopping the cycle of abuse, the addiction to trauma, the addiction to addictions, convenience, consuming, is ultimately what is in front of you. Joining a cause and having a reason to get better that is absent of moral obligation or responsibility. To miss the moral imperative from what people say and what people do. The option is limited by their options. And we can say checks and balances. We can also look at, history to guide us. And as an example, what would cause one to rebel against their parent? Taxation without representation. And if you are in agreement with where your money is going, if you are in agreement with America's reputation and actions and inactions, the diplomatic, international conflict that we all have individually is to choose to consume or not. And from an addiction standpoint, we have well crossed into that, and we have what we have, and we are dependent on keeping it. The supply lines are good for now. In the COVID response, that is a lot of people's reality now. The mark of a depression, meaning a low point in society. The grabbing of power and exercising control through bureaucratic and civilized means means you vote with your dollar. If we continue to contribute to the system that is taking more than it's giving for the preservation of the next generation, not just ours today. People living on survival mode only think of their needs for the day. Same thing with people who are in active addiction. Truly being able to stop yourself from doing something that you could not control means that there's something else at play. And we're not seeing it as a society and as a culture and as a system, as friends and as family and as neighbors. Or we have relegated to stay dissociated from the truth that death is upon us. Consumption is death. And so, in the greater spirit of what's the difference between a healer and a therapist, is that a healer is preparing you for death. For what else are we really talking about if we're not talking about that? So to expect change, you have to understand the source that desires it. And it's a natural desire to want things to be different than what they are. But the fact is that they are what they are. And accepting what you can change and what you cannot. And not taking the blame for other people's shortcomings or teachings. Forgiveness is necessary, and to not forget is a dangerous game. There's reasons why we forget. But the fact is that we can always remember. I think people are living dissociated from that. Because that's what America you have. You have a dissociative disorder and you don't know it. You also have addiction. You also have trauma. You also have abuse, meaning that you have abused others. America, we have our work cut out for us. Getting a diagnosis doesn't really feel that good, does it? So we have to be careful, America, with who we get it from, why we're getting it, and the system that it comes from. Because here's the flip side. What was once an abnormal response to an abnormal event, that was what the definition in the DSM that does the diagnostics was in 1980. 15 years later, a study called the ACE study demonstrated that trauma was actually more of an epidemic, with numbers that were so high that epidemiologists, they said that this doesn't really exist. It's the norm. And that dissociation was a normal response to a normal event, and it was a physiological thing, meaning a physical thing, meaning a medical thing. And the medical model has yet to accept dissociation, yet the numbers in the research is there to show that normal is to have been traumatized and to be living dissociated. And what I'm saying is that becoming addicted to the dissociation, to the story, that something didn't happen, knowing that something did, and that there's still some things that are unsettled, particularly between the generations. I would argue that we should all be in family therapy as best practices. Therapy has been leaning on best practices and evidence-based, but missing some common core understandings that the stress of modernization and industrialization and the existential threat of being taken advantage of and abused, the history of rebelling against tyranny as a requirement of the people, for the people, by the people. Without morality leading, you have bureaucratic tyranny. Ethics being equated to law is immoral. To be moral is to break the ethics. And until we can decide who is healed and who is not, we have to look at what they do. If people are not following, for example, drug laws because they are unethical, they are not legally sound, then they are immoral. So as an act of civil disobedience, people utilize them to help and have, under the threat of being arrested and locked away from a system that is trying to prevent what we know as healing. And so for the last 20 years, we have been diagnosing normal and treating something that is normal and not recognizing the systems of power and control that mental health serves and plays on us as being not normal or abnormal psychology. Under any stress, people will go to the point of breaking. It has to happen in order for new rings of us to grow. Growth and experience the the sayings that are handed down to us intergenerationally, the truths that they bear, the moral of their story, is to not accept the truth of their words unless they are followed up by action. And unfortunately, we need words first before we can know if the action will happen most of the time. And so my responsibility to you as a healing professional is to tell you the truth about what you're signing up for with psychedelic medicines from a recovery angle. It will test your ethical morals. It will test the system that you come from. It will test every aspect of your being, your historical foundations, your emotional truths. It will terrorize you in a way that you think is helping. Because if you don't do something with what you bring back, then it's hypocritical. And the application, the ability to recover, requires action. And from a recovery standpoint, this is where we can measure who is moral and who is abiding by unjust and unethical laws. Particularly when there is the choice of freedom. If freedom is a choice, then so is addiction. We have to be careful with what we are signing up for when we sign up for healing and/or therapy. Because if we believe that we're broken and can be fixed, or that we are separate, and that people say and do the same, then we haven't learned the moral of the story. With that, stuff for you to think about for next session.